In this session, we'll focus more on the differences between microservices and containers. We'll have more focus on microservices, less on containers. So for now, in this session, we'll explain containers in a more conceptual manner, more just to understand how microservices and containers play with each other. So what are we going to discuss today? So first, we're going to explain that microservices and containers are not the same and what they actually are. Then we'll have a deep dive on microservices with all the aspects that are involved in it. We'll describe how to decompose a monolith application into microservices, like a cookbook, let's say, of how to do that. Then we'll explain containers briefly, the concept and how it relates to microservices, and then we'll have Q&A throughout the So let's start. So, microservices and containers are not the same. I hope I said it enough times. But what actually are they? So, microservices is an architectural pattern. Okay? It's a way to design the system that will be more fit for many features and capabilities that we'll later discuss. And containers is just a technology, like a tool set, that, yes, can be used to help with implementing microservices, but not necessarily. So for some of you, the example I'm going to bring will make sense. Imagine that we have the visitor pattern, from design patterns. So it means that when you need to do a certain change on a list of items, it's very cool if you use the visitor pattern and define once what needs to be done, and then just give it to some iterator. He will visit all the elements in that collection, and he will do what you ask him to do. People have been implementing visitors for 10, 20 years now, right? Before Closure and Lambda expressions and everything like that, it was great. And then when Closure was introduced and Lambda expressions in Java was introduced, people said, oh, they work really well together because now I can even define what to do when I visit an element in a much friendlier way, less coding, right, and stuff like that. You can do so many things with Lambda expressions that are not related to visitor, right? And you can implement visitor without Lambda expressions. The fact that people today mention them so much together is because they're just a very good combination of pattern and technology that together fix a specific problem. Microservices and containers is exactly the same. Okay, you can implement microservices over VMs. You can even do it in processes. With containers, you can put monolith applications and just run them. So it's not necessarily the same thing, but the combination solves the problem in a very. Okay. So now that we know that microservices is just an architectural pattern, okay, let's actually discuss what it is. So we know what problems it solves and how. So there is no formal definition for microservices, but I did find some definitions from people that are appreciated in the industry for their insight on microservices. And looking at the two ways they describe microservices can help us see, various aspects of what this actually is. So the first one is by Adrian Cockcroft. And this is how he defines microservices. He says it's loosely coupled, service-oriented architecture with bounded context. Okay, is actually bringing us 3 points of what cloud services are. So loosely coupled, meaning that microservices needs to be decoupled from one another. Service-oriented architecture, like we know from the old SOA days, right? Each service is assigned a specific responsibility. This is what he's serving. And to give the user some capability, you need to orchestrate together a lot of services, right, that actually handle what you wanted the user to give. With bounded context, means that the responsibility of each such service is well defined. Okay, there is no overlap between them. Okay, so this is how Adrian sees it. And the next one is from Martin Fowler. So he says it like that. Also, he says there's no definition. This is how I see it. Developing a single application, right? We need to have a single delivery at the end. as a suite of small services, okay, note small, Adrian didn't mention anything about size, each running on its own process, so he is taking decoupling to an extreme, right, own process, and communicating with lightweight mechanisms. This is something that we haven't seen any reference to until now. So he's saying it's not only how you decouple the services and give each a unique responsibility, but you also need to govern the way they talk to each other to minimize dependencies by the APIs, right? Because you can bound them actually by the APIs. So before we explain each of these aspects and really understand what a microservice looks like, we need some motivation, okay? So last time we discussed cloud and cloud native. This is where we want to go. Why microservices? What's the motivation? So as we said, in the cloud there are a lot of risks, right? And instability and things that we should be afraid of and plan for in advance. And the approach applications are taking today is actually to put all the eggs in a single basket. Right? We have so many different capabilities running on that monolith service on a single process, and if it fails, we're losing all the capabilities of the system, right? And since we are going towards an environment that is very hostile, right, and we know that we need to minimize risk, it doesn't make sense to continue acting this way. Why monolithic applications were created in the first place? It's easier to develop, and it's much easier to scale up, right? We give, like we do, we say, give us additional 2 giga RAM of memory, amazing performance, right? And we can also add more and more and more capabilities to the system without having to go through the process of creating a new service and defining the interface, blah, blah, blah. We just code additional lines of code and we add it into the monolith and we have new capability. So in the cloud world, this is not the way to go. So we need to decompose and have like many, many, many small baskets with the X. And while doing so, we actually get something good, right? It's not just that we're just trying to be protective. We also have a gain that when we have those small risk baskets, we can be much more agile, right? Because if you want to introduce a change to a specific capability, now no one will tell you, but at this time of the release, are you going to touch this line of code? It's in the same process, same build process of that and that and that that are so critical, right? We've been testing them for so long. So the risk management that we now need to face is much easier, right? Because the changes are much more contained. So we gain agility while minimizing the risk and being more prepared to that risky world that we're facing. Okay, so we understand why we want to decompose into microservices. So let's take a closer look and see how it actually can be done. Okay, so from what we've seen in the not definition, we get the following. A microservice should be small, and small not only, in capability, but also lines of code, okay? Lightweight in terms of footprint, okay, in runtime. Independent, we'll touch it shortly, what it means, but it actually generally means that it can be changed without damaging too much the other microservices around it, and this is actually how we minimize the risk of change. It needs to be stateless, obviously, because microservices are prepared to a world of problems, of failures, right? So if it's stateful and it crashes, now where do I get all that info from? I've lost important information. So it needs to be stateless. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to hold everything in the database, because for some applications it doesn't make sense. But then what they tell you is that, okay, at least put it in a way that is reliable, like Memcache or other memory clustering solutions that will guarantee that if this node fails, another can replace it and still get that info that it needs. And also designed for failure. If you remember Netflix and all the apes, all the monkeys that come and create havoc. So it needs to be closely monitored, that microservice, and also the system needs to know how to recover from a failure in that specific microservice. As I promised, what does independent mean? So independent actually means that it needs to run on a dedicated process. So it sounds like a very technical thing in a design pattern, right? Doesn't really make sense. But it is important because what they actually tell us is that it needs to be isolated to the degree that even failures in other processes running on the same system, other code running on the same process, will not hurt it. It will not be impacted by out of memory of some other process, by increase of utilizing memory by another service running in the same process. It needs to be isolated as much as possible. So almost everyone today takes it to the degree of running on a dedicated process. Later in the container part, we'll see that we now even take it more to an extreme, right? And like run it on a dedicated container, which is like a dedicated machine entirely. So this isolation is very important. Upgradable and replaceable. This is very, very important because it actually helps us, we'll see it when we discuss how to decompose it, it helps us identify very easily which two parts should be separated from one another. Because if we say we have frequent changes to that module, but it's a shame that we need to refresh the entire set of modules with it, then it can be a very, very strong motivation for decoupling them into two different microservices. So, as we discussed in the last session, scalability in the cloud is done horizontally and not vertically, right? Meaning we add more instances, we don't increase the resources of that single service. And the fact that it can be scalable by its own gives us a big advantage because it actually means that if that specific service is consumed by all the users in the system and another service is consumed by half of the users in the system, I can scale it out much more than I scale this one out, and I'm not wasting, right, resources to scale out the big monolith like 10 times. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in utilizing the resources that I need and actually having peaks, because peaks can be from different reasons. More users at this hour or more execution at this hour, right? These can be two different services. Another important part of independent is that it's self-contained. It reminds me of, the object-oriented design principles that everything needs to be encapsulated, right, in your object. So it's taking it to the extreme. It actually means that your microservice, if you're now handling, let's say, execution, you need to handle everything end-to-end, from the UI, if it exists. We don't have UI for execution, like for the runtime itself, to the business logic, to the data access layer, right, and to the definition of the data model, meaning that the schema definition of what we need during execution, if we need it, is defined as part of this microservice. And this is actually how this can be replaceable by its own. Imagine that you replace only the business logic and no one updated the schema for you. Now you actually say, I need to replace two microservices to make a change, right? And this violates the whole point of what we have here. Every single microservice can be replaced on its own, independent of the others. So it needs to own the full stack end-to-end and has its own technology stack. So this is an interesting point. Why is that? So first, because we can, right? It's a different process. It's replaceable by itself. So if I want to write it in C++, I can, right? I'm not causing any cascading problem to any other microservices. And maybe I have a very good motivation for that because maybe I need native code for performance. Maybe that specific thing that I'm doing has already a great framework in another language. Maybe I was to use Vertica for the database because it's much more fit for my use case than the other microservice who can handle a relational database, right? And it will have great performance. So the variations that we allow in the technology stacks are really to improve each and every microservice by its own. But then it actually sounds like very risky, right? Because what we're actually saying that everyone can do what they want. Every developer wake up in the morning and say, for my microservice, I really want to learn this new technology. Maybe it's a fit, maybe it's not, but maybe, you could have done it in the existing technology, but it will take you a day less, right? Not such a big ROI. I'll create a new stack for that microservice. How this can be prevented. So Netflix and other companies are dealing with it in a very nice way. What they're actually saying is we're not trying to set governance rules. It doesn't make sense. We want developers to choose their own technology stack based on concrete reasons, right? If they have a good reason, yeah, this is what they need to do. How do we make sure that the noise of I'd like to, I have a feeling like I want to, will not happen? What they're actually saying is that if you manage all the tool sets as open source, it can be even internal open source, right? It doesn't need to be real open source. Then actually, people will want less and less to diverge from the mainstream of how you develop your code, because then they cannot rely on any of the tools that someone else already created. So what Netflix says is that actually people wanted to be aligned with the mainstream because of the rich toolset they open source completely. And when they had a very good reason, they calculated the ROI, the developers, and then they said, yeah, but I really need this specific technology, and I'm willing to invest in a new toolset just for that because I understand that it will bring a huge impact. So actually, they believe in incentives rather than governance. Touching on what we mentioned earlier, communication. So up until now, we defined what each microservice is by its own, and they're like isolated islands, right? Like, I have everything I need, I don't need to talk to anyone. And we know that's not true, because it's like we said, a service-oriented like architecture, right? We said a composition of services is actually what gives us the value that we need to provide to the customer. So they need to communicate with one another, and they need one another's results to carry on their own computation. So now we need to discuss how they actually communicate with one another. So these are the principles that are commonly acceptable for microservices. The communication needs to be very lightweight. Lightweight in terms of technology, okay? So Martin Fowler has a really nice term. He says, smart endpoints, dumb pipes. Okay, the pipes shouldn't have any business logic, any governance rules, policies, whatever. They just need to know how to take your message from one end and bring it to the other. It can be a REST call where you just specify in the URL, right, who you're talking to, and then the pipe is really dumb. And it can be a messaging bus when it's a bit more sophisticated because it manages subscriptions and knows which message to deliver to which subscriber. But again, they need to focus on routing capabilities, nothing more. If you know ESB technologies, enterprise service buses, they are the extreme opposite. It's not advisable in microservices because then you're actually tied to the logic that's in the communication, and that's not reliable, resilient. You don't have that self-encapsulation that we were looking for because some concerns that you're in charge of are implemented in the communication fabric. So this is an anti-pattern for microservices. Another very important thing, as we've already discussed, is backward compatibility. If we don't have backward compatible APIs, we cannot replace the microservices one by one, right? We need to identify the whole dependency chain, and we'll only be able to replace that set completely. And preferably, the communication should be non-blocking, meaning if service A calls out to service B and it's an asynchronous call, and now it needs to wait for the result from service B, then actually the availability or unavailability of service B affects how service A can continue doing his work. So in some cases, it's inevitable. But in a lot of cases, we just, service A just needs to notify a lot of other services of something that he's done. So do it non-blocking, right? You don't really need, like we send events. We don't really wait for anyone to do something with that. We just notify and move on. So when possible, this is the way to go. So usually, what we use for communication is RESTish API, and why Martin is using the form RESTish, because we know that no system in the world is compliant to the REST standards. So in the neighborhood of REST, and lightweight messaging bus. As I said, no ESBs. He gives example of RabbitMQ, ZeroMQ, which are very commonly used and are dumb enough to just focus on routing and not on anything else. It doesn't even allow that. And again, we have a case study to see how other people have done that. And the interesting part is that microservices is a relatively new pattern. But like all design patterns, we know that people have been using them for ages and ages without calling them by name, right? And the nice thing about defining the pattern is just that we can communicate very briefly. I say microservices and you instantly understand what I mean. But it's not like someone invented it. So a very nice use case of LinkedIn is how they sort of accidentally moved into a microservice architecture without even calling it that way or setting that as a goal, okay? They just did it step by step because that's what felt the most natural at each point in the way. So they've started like that. They had a monolith. They nicknamed it Leo. And it was hosting all the data in an Oracle database, obviously a big one. And everything was fine. And then they identified that, you know, that capability in LinkedIn that you can see the circle of your first level connections and second level connections. They can like give you capabilities of traversing those circles and going. So they use it in many different places. First, when they show you your connections, when you get the feed, right, of all the posts and everything, they order it by the proximity of how related to you those people are. And they also hinted that they have some rules in places they don't tell you that also uses this information. So they actually saw that they make a lot of calls to that logic, and they needed to extract it from the relational database, right, where they held all their data. And it's a self-join, right? It's a table of, I don't know, a person joined with a person, with a person, with a person. Those are awful queries. And they realized that they do it so many times, those inefficient queries, and it would make much more sense to put them in a dedicated process that will hold this big cache in memory. And whenever they'll need to use it, they'll just call it, and it will give them instantaneously the answer. So they created this service, right? They didn't call it microservice at the time. This service, they called it Graph. It had like a database. I call it async because it was asynchronous, a sync that is asynchronous, from the database using some technology. And they used the remote procedure calls to call out to the graph. Why remote procedure calls? I can only guess that they wanted to do minimal changes in their code base. And using RPC, you don't need to change any query that you're doing, right? It's like our Spring remoting. We keep calling the beans as if they were local, but they're actually served from remote. So RPC is the same. I call it as if that Java code is in the same process with me, but there's actually a remoting bridge that transfers this call to a different process. Which we'll see it's kind of an anti-pattern in microservice communication. But again, they didn't know of microservices, right? They just played it by hunch. So this is what they've done. And the nice thing is that it brought them so much value. And they say, why? It's amazing. So maybe each time we'll need to add a new capability into the system, we'll try to put it on a separate process because we see it brings us a lot of value. So they played with that. And in the year 2010, they had over 100 services in addition to Leo. They didn't say anything that you cannot code in Leo or that Leo should die or something like that. It was just a natural evolution of seeing the value and just wanted to recreate it over and over again. And eventually, in that year of 2010, they identified that the most of the development was done in services and not in Leo, okay, which is really great. And they managed to release every 2 weeks, and everything sounds great, right? So no, it was awful because they had numerous test failures. Tests could not run end-to-end. They had so many glitches. They had a lot of incompatibilities, right, between the services. The services changed behavior, changed protocol without notifying anyone. They had complex dependencies, and they understood that they're doing something that might be the right approach, but they're doing it in the wrong way. So they needed to make some changes. So maybe at the time, microservice conversations were more common. Maybe that's how it helped them to resolve it, or maybe they thought of everything on their own. I don't know who should get the credit. But they actually implemented all the best practices of microservices, and this is what solves their problems. So they had a fully automated continuous delivery. So they said, no, CI/CD needs to be automated end-to-end. They set strict backward compatibility rules. Up till then, it was like, be nice, be backward compatible. Didn't work. They had better defined boundaries between the services. They said, no, Graph is responsible only for that, and for other things, he will go to another service, and so on. Service ownership end-to-end was super important. It actually means what we said, that the full stack that is required, UI, business logic, data access layer, schema, should be owned in the boundaries of a single microservice. Remember that we had a lot of backward incompatibilities, partly because of that. And they moved to REST APIs. We'll see later on why REST APIs fit much more than RPC. Just a hint. Remember I told you they used RPC because probably they didn't want to change the code base and how they call. Big mistake. Okay, you cannot do it. Okay. So two things we need to consider before we continue with the great story of microservices. One bad and one good. So the first one is that you can go to extreme very easily. So if you now leave the room and think, yeah, we need to decompose everything, every 2 lines of code, no, break it into one, then you will end up with an anti-pattern that is called nanoservices, okay, where they're much too small, don't bring enough value on their own because they hardly do anything, and it's so hard to maintain them because you need to maintain backward compatibility, right, for those APIs, so you hardly can do any change. So we need to be careful from doing that. I saw a very nice line. I'm going to adopt it. It says that system architecture is not a science, it's an art. So you need to know where to stop. You need to balance between all the different concerns. Okay. Next one is a good statement for us in orchestration business. That now that you need so many microservices, right, you need to orchestrate it. Because you cannot really say, I'll have those, 200 processes running on my environment, and yeah, they will manage. Okay. So up till now, we discussed what microservices are. Okay, so how do we actually take a monolith application? What steps are required to define how to move it to a microservice application? So the first step we need to take is to better define the microservice boundaries, and it's not always that easy, because when all those capabilities on the left side are running on the same process, the code turns into a spaghetti naturally, right? In some places more, some places less, depends on the architecture of that code base. And now we need to make sure that we don't not only identify the different capabilities, which I think is relatively easy, but also to decouple them physically so they can run in independent processes. Okay, so all spaghetti needs to be untangled. So that's first about the definition. And second, we also need to take a look at the database, right? Because we said you need to own it end to end. So obviously you need to attach to each microservice that specific piece of UI it's producing, right? And then the UI needs to compose them in some way. Not sure that everyone is doing that, by the way, that they're taking it really to the extreme of creating the UI from lots and lots of pieces. A good example of a company who does that is Amazon, actually. I read that each button in Amazon website is rendered from a different microservice, completely. And then we need to take a look at the database and be able to identify the different schema pieces, or let's put it in a better way, the different data models, right, that belong to each of the services. And here there might be a catch, that I have an entity in my data model that is actually owned by two different services. What do I do then? So what at least the literature does is that it means that you are constructing your data model in the wrong way. Because, and they give an example, let's say your company has a sales organization and a development organization. What they call product and what they call product are two different things. So maybe you should rename them and say this is a product and this is a product in the marketing eyes. I don't know how to call it. But it's not they don't need the same info from the database, right? Marketing needs to know maybe price and size, and I'm making it up, okay? And development needs to know which repositories in Git are associated to this product, and so on and so forth. So what they're saying, split that entity into two different entities. Let each microservice manage the attributes of the entity that he is actually interested in, and then you have no conflict, and you can split it very nicely. Okay? So this split needs to happen as well. And as you can see on the right side, it's a good example of how scale-out factors can be different per microservice, right? So from this pinkish triangle, we can have two, and both are like owning the same data model, right? But again, they have their own data access layer encapsulated in their own instance. They're just saying the same piece of actual data in the database, while the other two have only one instance, and it's perfectly fine. If you need to join two things to have like aggregated view of something, then it's best from architecture point of view, I'm not talking about performance yet, to take each point separately, each piece of the data separately, and aggregate it in the higher level. I think Twitter are the ones who have a best practice that all aggregations are done only in the upper level. They saw that this is what brings them the most performance that they need. And if you see that there are two things that are so coupled together, two pieces of data that are so coupled together, then maybe you need to rethink ownership of who owns it, and maybe a single microservice should own it, unless, you know, it's totally different things. But running as a monolith gives us a lot of advantages, right? It's not all bad. People have been doing that for years, not because they're stupid, right? We have a lot of challenges in this decoupling, and yeah, we need to do it in a way that will not damage, you know, capabilities, performance, efficiency of development. You can always take the gradual approach, like break the monolith into two pieces, three pieces that are relatively easy and bring instant value. Later on, do the necessary refactoring to decompose further and further, right? It doesn't need to be like from 1 to 100 in 5 minutes, right? And this is specifically the places where you need to stop and think carefully how to do split. Okay, so up until now we said how to decompose the microservices, and we kind of neglected the communication between them. But as we said, this is a very important aspect because it shows that here the decomposition does not end in separating only the code and responsibilities. So one of the important things that we need to do when moving to a microservice architecture is actually rethink the way we construct our APIs. So we have a very good experience with that because we can look at the REST APIs that we have between our client code and server code, and between, you know, just two classes we have within the same process. So with two classes in the same process, they're very chatty, right? Because it's available, right? She's right next to me, that other class. And whenever I need something even small, I will just go and fetch it. And we know that it's even a good design pattern to get the minimal piece of information that you need in order not to be exposed right to the whole data model. In internal process communication, fine-grained APIs are the way to go, right? And this is how we write our code. But when we know that we communicate between the client code and the server, we know that we go through the network and they might not be close to one another, and all this round trip is very costly. So we have more coarse-grained APIs, right? We ask for an entire entity and not just for that little thing that I need right now. Now that we're taking that monolith and splitting it, let's say, into two services, we cannot keep those communications in the fine-grained manner, right? We cannot keep them chatting, because actually it will slow down the whole system, right? It talks so much, it takes so much time now and latency to get the answer, so I'm like blocked at every minute. I need something and I can't get it, so I'm waiting. This is exactly what I said about LinkedIn's experience with the RPC, right? My guess is that they wanted to stick with RPC to keep the calling code as is, and this was the mistake there. That's why they didn't get good performance, because they obviously went and said, give me the first friend, and then the second friend, and then the third, or maybe just give me his name, and now give me where he works, and so on. It's not a way to write the APIs. And also, as I said, use messaging when required, because we said that we prefer non-blocking and notifications versus synchronous calls. So whenever possible, take a look at the API and say, maybe I don't really need to send a REST call to that other end. And if it's now down, then I cannot just continue, right? Okay. Now, an interesting thing is that in all the architecture blogs that you read in about microservices, everyone talks about the team structure. And it sounds kind of funny, because what do those architects know about how to manage teams, and how does it relate even to one another? So there was a very smart guy who in 1968 phrased a law that is being used even today and treated very seriously, and it's called Conway's Law. It says that when organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structure of these organizations, it actually means that if now I decide to have a UI team and a backend team managed by different people, running on different backlogs, if I look at the product that this group will actually produce at the end, I will be able to identify how the communication patterns between those two groups are. Okay? I will see if they work closely together, if they have joint meetings, if not, if their managers speak to each other or not. And you see it in documentation all the time. And you see it in all many places. So it actually means that no matter what we do in the blueprints, we will design an amazing architecture for an application, as long as the teams continue to look like that, okay? The only thing they will be able to produce is a layered application, not a microservice one. Because this is how the teams are structured, and it will always resemble the system that they will actually produce. And if you want to get an architecture that looks like that, then the teams must look like that. Okay? So if you want to have a microservice that is self-contained and having its own UI and data model and business logic, then on that team we need to have people who can handle all these aspects. Okay? Otherwise it will simply not work. And remember that we said that they need to be relatively small, right? Lines of code term, each microservice. So there's another nice way into looking at that. The CEO of Amazon called a very popular term called a two-pizza team. And this is the reason. He said that if you have a meeting of a team that requires more than two pizzas to feed them, then you need to fire someone. The team is too big. So saying two-pizza team might sound like a different quantity to different people here, according to taste and personal habits. So in the industry, they usually talk about an 8+ team. Okay? So 8+ team should be able to have a 16 to manage with 16 slices of pizza. Okay, so just to clarify something, it doesn't mean that we cannot have smaller microservices, right? Because we say a team of 8. Maybe I have a microservice that's so small, only 2 people need to handle it. So what do I do then? So it's actually one-to-many relationship, right? One team can handle many microservices, but it must own them, okay? So you can own system management, content management, and user management, okay? But it's still, each of them is a microservice, and a single team is responsible for all of them. It's just a very nice, I'm sure all of you have seen it before. It's a very nice analogy of how architecture has evolved in the last century. We started with they call it copy-paste architecture, but the nice term is procedural programming, right? You write a method and everyone can call it and people just copy-paste, 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 and then you end up with a pile of spaghetti. Then the most popular pattern was layers, right? And as you see, each layer can be unique. You can have zucchini in that layer and eggplant in that layer and tomatoes in that layer. So you have data and you have business logic and you have a 3-tier application, 4-tier application. I've once seen a blueprint of a 5-tier application. Okay, and that was the state-of-the-art architecture in the early 2000s. And now we have moved to a ravioli architecture, meaning that you have self-contained, small, eatable pieces of pizza. Each one can have its own filling. The dough can be made from different things, right? You can have a spinach ravioli and a sweet potato ravioli in the same plate. And you can scale out, scale down. Now that you're awake, let's move to OO. So let's have a small exercise, okay? And let's see how we can decompose OO. And as I said earlier, we can do it in phases, right? You don't go from a monolith to 100 microservices in one iteration. You decompose and then decompose. One of the important aspects to consider is that we need to be greedy when we decompose, right? Because we know we'll pay a price. Like you said and other people said, we'll pay a price with backward compatibility and communication and changes to the code and handling data ownership issues that might be very problematic and performance and stuff like that. So what is really our motivation when we come to decompose? So personally, I believe it should be 2 things, 3 actually. One is if we need pieces to be replaceable independently, then we'll split them. The second principle should be scalability. If we know that we have different personas using different pieces of the code, right, they need to be splitted so they can scale up independently. And the third that is less important is that if we have a very justified reason to move to a different technology stack, then obviously, right, we'll split. Okay, so the obvious decomposition of Central is to 2 big, relatively big pieces. One is management, and one is the worker, which I call here execution because we need to talk in capabilities, right, and not in nouns. So one piece is doing management, one is doing execution. Let's see how my 2 principles apply here. So scalability, right? The end users are using the management part. They do it only so often because it's admin. It's not even end users oriented. Execution is happening all the time, right? In all hours. Obviously, we need to scale out differently for each of the 2. Replaceable, again, if I have an urgent bug in execution, I don't want people to notice of changes in the management, which is more right visible to them. So I will minimize the risk. I will change only that part of the execution, and I will not need to bother that maybe now you cannot no longer log in into the system, right? Because someone else has done changes to the management at the same period of time. So this is one way to split Central into microservices. But obviously, we can be much more extreme, right? And since this is only a slide we can do whatever we want. So imagine how we would split like that. So in the management, and even that can be broken into 2 different parts, right? Didn't have enough room in the slide. We can have, let's say, content management and system management in the same place, in the same microservice. And then we say, okay, execution, right? It's a dedicated microservice. But now triggering, right, has its own frequency. It's not necessarily the same end user that does management. In case like we have a customer who build their portal, end user portals, right? We know a lot of our customers are doing that. So the frequency of triggering and the frequency of management is not the same. It's not the same people. So we can have triggering in a dedicated microservice. And we can have reporting. And then we can have authentication, right? And we are going to have authentication as a dedicated microservice not even written by us, but by another group. They could have used a different technology stack. They're not, but potentially they could have, right? We don't care. And we can split further and further, and again, each split needs to bring value. We don't do it just for fun. So I'll repeat the question because I don't think you heard it. The question was, are there any security concerns when we do the split? So it's an excellent question. It's actually one of the characteristics of being a self-contained microservice actually means that each microservice, right, exposes its own set of APIs, and it needs to validate, again, who that user is that is calling. In a layered architecture, you know that if the request passed through the upper layer where all the validations took place, then yeah, all the underlying services are free to serve any request and no problem. But in a microservice application, you can never assume that because you don't know who called you. So the pattern that is being used in a microservice architecture is actually to get a token. And at the entry point of each microservice, you go to that microservice, like the IDM we showed here, that is in charge of authentication and authorization, and validate the token with it, right? Tell it, listen, I got this token. Can I serve the request or not? And then the IDM tells you yes or no, and then you serve the request. So yes, you now need to protect each and every microservice by its own. How microservices can be very nicely implemented using containers. Okay, so why containers? Containers is actually an evolution of the virtualization that we've experienced in the past years. We moved from physical machines to VMs, right? And containers are actually the next generation. Okay. The point in containers is that you build your piece of application that is in the container once, you configure it once, and once it's packaged in a container, it can run everywhere. Okay? Because it's always within that box that protects it as it goes. It's not very exposed to the differences in the environments it runs in. And it's fast to deploy, we'll see why. And it also reduced footprint from a VM, again, we'll see why. If we look at VMs, again, another very famous diagram. If we look at VMs, then what you actually see is that for each physical machine, you need to have, right, bare metal, the server. On top of it, you need an operating system, right? Because nothing can run without an operating system. And by the way, it can be very minimal. Today, we have distributions of Windows that don't have UI, don't have all the interactive modes. It can be very lightweight. On top of that, you will need some hypervisor, right? Like a VMware one, a Hyper-V one. And then on top, you have the different VMs. And each VM, as we know, comes with its own instance of an operating system. And that's why I can have a Windows VM on the same ES6 server when you have a Linux VM, right? And we don't conflict with one another. Each of us, apart from the plain OS, needs also extended packages, right? Like maybe Linux packages that we need in addition to the distribution of the data of the OS, and it might be different from one VM to another. Maybe I need some capabilities that you don't need, so I've included them in my OS before I took the snapshot, and you did not. And the application is on top. What containers are actually doing is that they take the same bare metal, and you still need a host VM. They're cheating a bit because the Docker is equivalent to the hypervisor, so it should have been like horizontal as well and taking up like the same space. But as you can see, the applications on top do not come with their own operating system copies. So you actually save a lot of space, and you can crowd more applications on the same server. How do they do that? So if they actually share the same operating system as the one that already exists in the host, it's been reused. And as you can see, they can extend it with their specific binaries and libraries that they need, right? But again, they will be shared across all applications who are actually using, depending on the same set of libraries and bins. That's one. And second, you could have different containers that need different operating systems, but again, if I need a Linux OS and you need the Linux OS, it will be only once, okay, for all of us. That's why it's reduced footprint, and also why it's faster to start and stop. Just imagine how time it takes for your computer to start up, and that's only the operating system, right? In this mode, the operating system is always up, and the only thing you need to restart is the application, which is, according to how you coded it. It might be slow, it might be fast, but without the overhead of the OS. Now, I hope we can understand why it's actually better to gather microservices with containers. You get good isolation, which you could have gotten on a VM, right? You could implement microservices on a VM, but due to the reduced footprint, you can crowd more and more and more microservices on the same machine. And due to the fact that restart is much faster, you can handle failures in a better manner, right? Because if one container falls down and I can start another one and it will take it 2 minutes to start, amazing. So I can just, compensate for the loss of one with starting the other, and don't need to have a high level of redundancy just because all these switches take a lot of time. So as I said, the combination is very common, but it's still very important to understand they are not the same thing. This is an architecture pattern and a tool set that have an amazing symbiosis, but each can live without the other and they can still be fully implemented. Thank you very much.